Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to the next of the Abrahamic faiths, in this case, Christianity, the largest religion in the world. And essentially, here we're going to be looking at the first 100 years, kind of a brief look of the first 100 years of the Christian faith. And on the screen, we have an image of a Cairo, which is shorthand for Christ in Greek, and then a statement there from Jesus of Nazareth, the founder of this movement, from the Gospel of John: I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So, kind of starting off here with the early life of Jesus, some of the similarities and differences between the Gospels. And one of the things that the church has done is that they've taken the stories of Jesus and they have turned them into a chronological setting, a chronological story, but individually they are different. Like, for example, if I was to ask you what was the first miracle of Jesus, many of you would probably respond, well, the turning of the water into wine at the wedding of Canaan. Okay. And if I asked you, how do you know that? You might say the Bible, but the Bible at one time didn't actually exist. But let's go a little further. Matthew's gospel mentions no such event. Neither does Mark's gospel. Neither does Luke's gospel. Only John describes that event. If all for you regarding the life of Jesus would have been the Gospel of Mark, then Jesus' first miracle would have been an exorcism, because that's what is first reported in Mark. So, starting off, of the canonical Gospels, which would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the word canon refers to the rule or the standard. Only Matthew and Luke discuss the childhood of Jesus. So, of the canonical Gospels, again, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, only Matthew and Luke discuss the childhood of Jesus. And there are similarities between those two Gospels, but there are also differences. We're going to look at that in a moment. But Mark and John do not mention anything regarding the childhood of Jesus. And that is because either they didn't know anything regarding his childhood, or they did, but they didn't find it important enough to comment on. And Jesus would have been born sometime during the years of 8 to 4 BCE/BC. This is something that I always wondered when I first started looking into this topic, looking into history and whatnot. Because BCE is the equivalent, of BC, and BC stands for before Christ. So how could Jesus have been born before the time period that's set for him to be born? Well, the reason why essentially is that the monk who came up with our Christian calendar, I believe his name was Dionysius Exiguus, I think that was his name, but simply put, he made a mistake. He made a mistake in his dating. And a lot of it has to do with Herod the Great, who was the client king of Israel. Herod dies in the year 4 BCE/BC. And of course, Jesus is born during the reign of Herod. So Jesus couldn't have been born any later than 4 BCE. I'll mention that with Herod, mentioning similarities and differences. Matthew, Herod is referenced very prominently. In Luke's gospel, he is mentioned only in passing. But anyway, factoring in, say, the flight into Egypt and whatnot, historians give the dates for Jesus' birth sometime during the years of 8 to 4 BCE, sometime during there. And Matthew and Luke, they both hold that Jesus was born to a virgin woman named Mary and that he was born Jewish. So that's one point that Matthew and Luke agree upon, that Jesus was born to a virgin woman and that he was born Jewish. Matthew and Luke, they both hold that Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea. So that's another point where Matthew and Luke agree upon that Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea. But now here's where the differences begin. In Matthew's gospel, Mary and Joseph, Jesus' parents, they are residents of Bethlehem who later reside in Nazareth. So, according to the account that's found in Matthew's gospel, Mary and Joseph, Jesus' parents, they are residents of Bethlehem in Judea. Jesus is born in Bethlehem in Judea. But then these wise men, these magi from the east, arguably they were from Persia, as the word magi refers to the priestly caste, they arrive and have a conversation with Herod, Herod the Great, who's also known as Herod the Wicked, who was the client king of Israel. And they inquire about this newborn king of the Jews, which the statement terrifies Herod. So they ask them to locate this newborn king of the Jews, and they happen to discover that, at least from Matthew's perspective, that the king would be born in Bethlehem, referencing the prophecy in Micah, although there are some historians that do question if the Messiah actually has to be born in Bethlehem or just be of the Davidic lineage. But regardless, so story is that they are informed that the Messiah, the newborn king of the Jews, more specifically, would be born in Bethlehem. So these magi, these wise men, go to Bethlehem. They find Jesus and they give him offerings. But then they are told not to go back to Herod because Herod asked them to tell him where he was. But they instead go back to their country through another route. This infuriates Herod, who orders the male children in Bethlehem, 2 years and younger, to be killed. But Joseph, Jesus' foster father, is warned about this in a dream, and he and Mary and the child Jesus, the infant Jesus, escape into Egypt, what's known as the flight into Egypt. And then later, they are informed that Herod is dead, and Joseph sets to return to Israel, to Judea, but he is nervous about Herod's son, who is now essentially in charge of Judea. So he instead decides to settle in Galilee and in a town called Nazareth. Luke's gospel mentions nothing of that. In Luke's gospel, Herod is mentioned only in passing. In Luke's gospel, Mary and Joseph, Jesus' parents, they're residents of Nazareth who go to Bethlehem due to a census, and then they later return to Nazareth. So in the Gospel of Luke, Mary and Joseph, Jesus' parents, they're residents of Nazareth, and then the census comes out from the Emperor Augustus, the Roman emperor, who essentially was asking for the world to be enrolled. And so Joseph, who was of the Davidic lineage, goes to Bethlehem, which is the hometown of David. And while they are there, him and Mary, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And then later, They returned to Nazareth. That scenario is absent in the Gospel of Matthew. So, looking forward here, moving forward, some other similarities and differences. The non-canonical Gospel of Infancy Thomas, it talks about Jesus' childhood from the age of 5 to 12, which ends with Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem. So, the non canonical Gospel of Thomas, which has often been viewed as a Gnostic text, although I would dispute that, Jesus seems all too human in many cases in that text, though he's a child with extraordinary powers. But the text ends with Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem. But in any case, it talks about his life from the age of 5 to 12. And this work, at its earliest, may have been written around the same time as the Gospel of Luke. The canonical Gospel of Luke, it also discusses Jesus being in the temple in Jerusalem at the age of 12, which is absent from the Gospel of Matthew. The image that I have on the screen shows Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem at the age of 12, and it's a scene from the Gospel of Luke. And the non canonical Gospel of Infancy Thomas ends with Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem, but Matthew's Gospel mentions no such event. After the age of 12, which is found in the Gospels of Infancy Thomas and Luke, none of the Gospels, whether they're canonical or non canonical, discuss the life of Jesus until the start of his ministry. So, after the age of 12, which you find in the Gospels of Infancy Thomas and in Luke, none of the Gospels, whether they're canonical or non canonical, discuss the life of Jesus until the start of his ministry. There is it's not a Gospel, but it's what is known as the Book of Baruch, which is no relation to the work that is ascribed to Jeremiah's companion um, in the Deuterocanonicals of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians refer to as the Old Testament. This text is a Gnostic text, and it does talk about Jesus at the age of 12, where he is tending sheep in Nazareth. But regardless of which, after the age of 12, found in the canonical Gospel of Luke and the non-canonical Gospel of Infancy Thomas, none of the Gospels, whether they're canonical or non-canonical, discuss the life of Jesus until the start of his ministry. And one of the questions, is sometimes, what was Jesus doing um, for this period of time? And um, the truth of what he was doing would probably kill the mystique that's been created about him. What he probably did was odd carpentry jobs in and around Nazareth. That's probably really what he was doing. Um, One thing historians have argued a possibility is that Jesus may have spent some time in a town called Sepphoris, which is located about 3 miles from Nazareth. Um, Today it is in ruins, but in Jesus' time it was a major Greco Roman city. And one of the statements that Jesus makes a lot in his ministry is the word hypocrite. And the word hypocrite was commonly said in a lot of Greek plays. So it's possible that Jesus sat in on a play in Sepphoris, or he might have been able to hear it one night with the wind blowing into Nazareth. Well, we're going to need to stop here, and when we come back, we will continue on with the first portion.